Hello again, risk community. Welcome to another video tutorial to help you get started and make the best of ServiceNow. My name is Eric Ferron in Santa Clara, California, and my guest today for this new episode is Scott Ferguson. Scott recently joined the risk business unit as director for outbound product management. And today with him, we're going to be talking again about entities, formerly known as profiles. You may remember that a few weeks back, we already had a video tutorial on the show with our guest speaker, Eric Lemartre, who gave us a pretty detailed deep dive on profiles. And there's been some changes in the world of profiles. One of them that they are now called entities. And we also felt it would be a good reminder for everybody to take another look at what is now called entities with Scott. So good afternoon, Scott, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Eric. It's my pleasure to be here. Today, we're going to talk about the fact that the profiles, the old term that everyone is aware of, knows about, but was a ServiceNow term, was not recognized within the industry. There's been a change in the terminology to bring it more in line with what people would understand. So the second thing we're going to talk about today is why entities are important. Why do we need them? How should we set them up? Why people have struggled with understanding the concept within ServiceNow. And thirdly, we're going to try to give some examples of how people have used entities in their instances. You probably remember this slide from the previous session, and this slide was really a depiction of how the scoping process worked within ServiceNow. As we move forward in kind of defining a different perspective of what that may look like, we want to look at the architecture holistically. You've got the policy and compliance here in the bottom left, where you've got your authoritative documents and your policies and the risk frameworks and those risk statements, or now these are kind of the first part. It's the external information that's coming in. It's the information that you need to use to guide and direct the organization.
And just a very quick plug here for UCF. We have a video tutorial about UCF, what it does and how to use it by Ben Forrest. Please check it out on the community.
So the next step as we look at architecture is really then defining what are those things that I care about that would be associated to the series of risks and control objectives that we defined in the first phase. The scoping exercise that you go through can really look at various things. It can be people, it can be places, it can be things, and we'll get into some examples of that as we go forward. But you go through this scoping exercise to say, here are the things that I care about. This is where they exist in ServiceNow, whether it's a location table or it's a people table, it's a CMDB CI or an asset or whatever that may be. You put together these definitions of, I care about things that are in scope for Sarbanes-Oxley, or are mission critical, or financial applications, or in a particular geo, or whatever that may be. You define this entity type. Upon saving that, you end up with a series of entities that are then automatically associated to, through the relationships with the risk frameworks and the policies, a set of risks and controls. A risk is assigned to an owner, the controls are assigned to an owner based upon that definition. Now those owners then manage that work through various user experiences, whether it's through the service portal where they can interact with and respond, they can generate risk events, they can request policy exceptions, they can generate or approve or decline policies that may be routed to them for approval. They can see the roll-up reporting on their dashboards, and they can do this through mobile as well, where the new mobile app, they can interact with the GRC applications the same way. Underpinning that, you've got the assessments, right? I may have to do an attestation of a control or an assessment of a risk all through these various user portals. And then the final phase of this is around audit engagement. Now, an audit engagement within the audit application is going to be a set of activities that may need to be performed, such as I need to complete a SOX audit for the previous year, or we need to do a PCI audit of all of our systems that contain cardholder data. Well, the first phase of an audit engagement is defining that scope, where you're going to select, here are all of those entities that we need to bring into this particular engagement in order to perform this audit exercise. And then you move forward into the field work. Those entities bring with them the risks and the controls that populate the risk library and the control library with the test plans that you're then used to generate the control tests. You have different task-based activities like interviews and walkthroughs, and you generate issues and findings and eventually an audit report, all keyed off the fact that at the beginning of that engagement, you brought a series of these entities into scope for that particular application. The entities are core, standing between the risks and the policies and the actionable risk and controls assigned to individual owners. They're core to defining scope of an audit engagement. They are at the center of what makes ServiceNow GRC successful.
This is great, Scott. So let's try to bring now the entities to life in simple terms.
Basically, the entities can be defined as those people, those places, those objects or things. It's the things that we need to manage risk with. It's the things that we're going to have to apply controls to. It's the things or the people or the places that we need to be able to audit as part of an engagement. And in most cases, Eric, as I work with different customers around the globe, when people are struggling to grasp the concept of an entity, I ask them, I'll say, well, show me your control matrix or show me your risk matrix. And typically it's a spreadsheet. And I'll say, well, read the first line to me. And they'll say something like, well, all web servers need to have certain ports closed. Or they'll say something like, all critical financial systems need to adhere to change management. And I tell them to stop right there. They just defined the entities. It was all critical financial servers need to follow the change process. That's a control that needs to be applied to a specific set of entities.
Excellent. I think this really clarifies everything. So we are going to be looking at some examples now, right?
Yes. So let's go to a couple. We're going to start pretty high, and we'll go a little bit deeper as we go here. So the first example, an object or a thing in any industry. Things like all servers have to be configured the same way. In other systems and in traditional ways of doing GRC, what would happen is the auditor would come in and they would take a sample of records and they say all servers have to be configured this way. And when they would find one that wasn't configured that way, they would fail the control test. When the reality is it was only one server. Now, with entities, right, we're able to say, let's assign this hardening control to each one of these systems. And then we can go through this exercise to say, well, of those 10,000 servers, 9,999 of them were all compliant, and we can really then focus in on the one thing that was not. We can keep the individual owner of those servers accountable as opposed to then penalizing the entire organization for one particular area that may have broken down in the process. Before we had entity, we may say something like, all banks have to follow some process. They all need to be compliant. And what happens when you go through an audit or you go through a series of control tests is you find out that you've got some random system that people really don't care about when it comes to being mission critical to the bank. It has to do with hosting the cafeteria menu. You may have people upset internally, but it's not going to affect the business. Well, they go through this audit because that system didn't follow change management. The whole bank fails that particular audit. With entities, we can start to segregate these. These are the ones we really care about, and we're going to associate a particular control. What are those assets, those systems, those people, places, and things that aren't going to be compliant? And when we go through that particular audit process, we can see that when that system, that application that wasn't adhering to the process, we can focus in on holding them accountable to what they need to do. The customers are really going to care whether or not there's proper controls around the financial systems. Are they protecting my money? And when an auditor reports to the street, in this case, they could say, yes, they've got proper controls in place, realizing that there are some internal things that they need to be able to address. Let's talk about this in a non-IT way. I was working with one organization before they had entities. They had certain requirements saying that every one of their locations that would store drugs, they maybe a pharmacy, and they may have certain drugs on hand that have got federal guidelines and they have to have material safety data sheets posted. Well, in this case, when you would go through a compliance activity, managing that for an organization was painful. they'd have to send emails to every location manager and say, do you have all of your stuff associated? And they manage this back and forth, maybe with shared drives and email and spreadsheets, and making sure every location was doing exactly what they were supposed to do was kind of difficult. And in many cases, things would slip through the cracks, and then when an audit would happen, they would fail. With entities, we can make this much easier, and things aren't going to fall in through the crack. So what happens here is you generate these entities. In this case, is a location. It's not a server. It's not a IT thing. That every location was an entity, and they could associate controls to that entity, like it needs to have material safety data sheets, or every employee has to have a background check, or there has to be security cameras, and there has to be a safe to store controlled substances at night. And each one of those controls would be assigned to the local owner or the local manager of that particular location, who could then provide the evidence, could complete the tasks, provide the information for the control test that they needed, which in turn, things weren't going to fall through the cracks, because they could easily report on the tasks and what locations are doing the things that they're supposed to do, what locations aren't, and they could make sure that all of their individual pharmacy locations were then compliant with the controls and they didn't miss anything. To give another non-IT example, in the transportation industry, you've got bus drivers, you've got people that have to maintain a license, right? A CDL and an eyesight test, and there's things that they have to do in order to be a driver. Well, how do you know that those individuals are up to date on their certifications? In this case, you can actually have an entity be an individual, a person, and assign to them, the task assigned to them is you need to provide on an annual basis a copy of your CDL or an eyesight test. And as an organization, if you're going to do a sampling of data and maybe you find some people haven't done what they should do, you're going to fail that audit, right? And the organization fails. But with the entities, as you set up a driver as an entity, and each one of them, as they're assigned the task, it says, well, yes, here's my evidence, and here's the results of my eye test. This can actually benefit you in a couple of different ways. Not only are you getting all of the information from all of those people, but you also have the ability to look at some other trends. Things like, are there particular delays in certain areas, or do people have a difficult time getting the appointments in a particular area, right? You can look at other trends and making sure, why are we not adhering or getting our compliance activities done? And you can start to find those trends within the data because I have those individual tasks assigned. So one more example, working in sales in my previous stage of my career, there was a process where all of the salespeople needed to provide a particular certification. Now, this is an example where if a sales manager, right, is not doing their job on the anti-corruption certificates, you could have a situation where there's a breakdown, right, and the whole company could fail and it gets reported to the street, and that would be a terrible, horrible thing. Well, if we do this through entities, we can look at it by geo, or look at it by department, or we can look at it by line of business, and we can start assigning these out. And as the individuals go through adhering to or attesting to their control or providing the evidence for that particular control, saying that they've done that work, we can also then start seeing where there's a breakdown in the process. Do we have people that aren't getting it done in a timely manner? And we can actually see this, as opposed to just having the whole organization pass-fail. We can look at particular areas and then address those in a proactive manner based upon the performance of them completing their individual control tests.
So let's take a few steps back now, and please give us a sort of overall conceptual summary here.
But if we take a step back, it's really a fundamental change in the way that we look at governance, risk, and compliance activities. In my experience in the past, auditors would come in, they would say, we're here to audit a process, and they would sample data. They would sample information from that process, and then they would deem whether the process was a success or a failure across the board. And you find there's a huge difference between a mission-critical financial system or a critical financial system and an internal system that really doesn't matter to the business. And what happens with a process-centric view of compliance, or a process-centric view of risk, one failure, even a minor one, can cause you to fail that entire process. So ServiceNow is going to turn this on its side. Before entities, before profiles, it was process centric. With entities, it allows us to have an asset centric view of governance, risk, and compliance. We can focus in on individual areas. We can measure a critical financial system versus a non-critical financial system. We can measure a geo or a region against another. We can manage the individual control activities at a specific location and manage them appropriately. So then these missteps or these minor missteps you can identify quickly, you can address without affecting the overall compliance or the overall risk of the entire organization globally. It gives you that focus or that granularity to hold individuals accountable where they need to be held accountable. It's an asset-centric view of governance, risk, and compliance, and it really is a shift in mindset and a different way of looking at things that can really make a huge improvement in the way that you look at and measure compliance and risk activities.
Thank you very much for this, Scott. So what would be your guidance and your advice for our audience to do right now?
The first thing that I would have you do is look at the tutorial that was done recently around entities that went into in-depth and how to define them, and familiarize yourself with it. Or maybe if you've watched it once, watch it again with the clarification or the shift in mindset that we've talked about in today's session, and see if it helps you understand the functioning or how entities work going forward. The second thing I would do is, if entities are still not clear at this point, I recommend you join the community. Go out to the community for ServiceNow, join the Governance, Risk, and Compliance forum, and post your questions there, and we can provide some additional guidance for you. And then the third thing that I would recommend you do is, if you have a process now that is manual and you're looking to move into ServiceNow GRC and you've been struggling with the concept of profiles or entities, go look at that spreadsheet that is your control matrix now, or your risk register, and read the details of the individual lines. You're probably going to find that you've already defined the entity types in the definitions that you have in your spreadsheets today.
Scott, thank you very much for your time. I think that we are all now very clear about not only what entities are, but also the value that they provide to our businesses. So again, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for being with us and listening to this. Remember that the slides are available in PDF format in the community. Scott and other ServiceNow specialists will be available on the GRC forum to answer your questions. Until next time, goodbye.